Alright. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. So, as we get closer to the election, I decided it was time for me to kind of ramp up my videos. My plan was to do one a day. I've faded in that plan, largely because I had a trial. So, for the first time ever, I'm doing a second video in the same day, mainly because I kind of want to get my proposition analysis done. First off, anybody who hates the Los Angeles Rams or is otherwise a Niners fan or even a Seahawks fan, they are getting absolutely destroyed right now by the New Orleans Saints. It's a crushing, right? It's 35-14. But I digress. So, speaking of Los Angeles, that transitions us very well to the next topic, which is Proposition 10. Like Proposition 6, this is probably one of the two most important, or at least the two most controversial propositions on the ballot. These are the ones that I think have a really tactile effect on most Californians, right? So most people already know what Proposition 10 generally does. But let me kind of outline it for you. In short, Proposition 10 does two things, one fairly major and then one kind of fairly minor. The first thing that Proposition 10 does is it repeals the Costa-Hawkins Act, which was made into law in February of 1995. What does Costa-Hawkins do, you might ask? Well, I'll answer. Costa-Hawkins does three things. It limits rent control. And it limits rent control by telling cities, you cities can't pass rent control if you do these things with it. Thing number one, attach it to any new building made after 1995, right? And this is important. There's a reason they did that, right? There's a reason Costa-Hawkins said that rent control ends here with like old buildings but not new buildings. Thing number two is that you can't apply it to single-family homes. So if somebody's renting out their home, right, they can rent it for however much they want to rent it for. And three, it said that homeowners and apartment owners get to start their initial rates, right? So in other words, the initial rate gets to be set. So there are reasons why all three of those things are important. Let's go with the most recent thing I said first. The reason why it's important for homeowners and apartment owners to set rates is rent control says, pick the city, right? Rent control initiatives basically say after point X you can only increase by 1 or 2% a year, right? So if you do that, then the base amount is important, right? Because if the base amount is not enough to recoup profit, or it's not enough profit to invest elsewhere, right, you're not going to be able to make that profit up on the back end if you're a developer, right? So that base amount is important. So what ends up happening with rent control is once somebody leaves an apartment, the owner is no longer bound by rent control. He can change his rate under Costa-Hawkins. He can say, all right, we're going to set a rate at, basically double what it was, right? So if I have a friend that lives in San Francisco, and she decides to leave her apartment in San Francisco, her rate, and then let's say she leaves for a month and then comes back, right? She gets rid of her contracts and comes back. Her rent's going to go up exponentially, right? Because she left, she's back, so she's now a new tenant, right? So when that happens, that Costa-Hawkins allows for developers to reset the initial amount when a tenant leaves, right? Getting rid of that ability, right, could potentially force these developers, these apartment owners, into situations where they're stuck with a base rate for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, right? And it just becomes less incumbent upon them to build and develop new houses because they're not going to recoup profit in the 5, 10, 15, 20 year long term. That becomes especially problematic when you attach it to single family homes. So people rent out single family homes, probably like an Airbnb situation. They rent out the single family home, they leave like for the summer or something, or it's just a second home and they deal with it that way. With rent control, it's going to be less likely that those people will rent out homes, right? And if it's less likely that they decide to rent out their home, then what will inevitably happen is that there will be less apartments for lack of a better phrase, less rental properties on the market, which could decrease significantly the availability of those funds, right? Those houses, which obviously means if you're somebody who is looking for a cheap place, all of a sudden you're going to be swamped out of any place, right? Because less people are going to be wanting to rent their homes. This is even more problematic with the third and most important thing that this thing does. It allows cities to instill rent control for places beyond 1995. This is critical. This is super important, right? Think of every new apartment building you see in LA, San Francisco, San Jose, etc., right? Those right now are protected from rent control. Protected, right? I would submit to you, and I imagine developers would probably also submit to you, that the only reason those buildings were built is because developers knew that they would be insulated from profit-seeking or profit-destroying measures like rent control that would prevent them from recouping on their investment. Right? An investment is only made if it's profitable. An investment is only made if somebody can make a profit off of it. If you're a company, a developer, and I know we like to look, I know developer is a curse word, right? I get it. I know developers are maligned, and some probably rightfully so, right? I get that. But here's the problem. Developers are the only ones that build these buildings, right? We don't build them. You know, doctors don't build them. Lawyers don't build them. Construction workers and developers do, right? And without the developers, the construction workers don't know what they're building and where and for whom, right? Right? You need the developer to sort of originate the project, to buy the land, to set it up, to get the capital investment going. If you think they are evil, they are a necessary evil. They are necessary, especially when you talk about homelessness. So, when you're telling developers, right, that any and all properties that they have could be subject to rent control years after they've made the initial investment believing that it wasn't subject to rent control, you do two things. One, you suck away their profits and you suck away their incentive. Two, and this is more important, you suck away their reason to invest in future investments. You know, in my Proposition 5 video and in my Proposition 1 video, I talked about how the need for housing is a need of supply, right? We're basically being outstripped for supply by 100,000 units a year. We need 100,000 more units a year. The only people who build those things are developers, right? So when you pass laws that disincentivize them from developing, you're creating a bigger supply gap, not a smaller one, right? So Proposition 10 is a very classic case of a very small group of people benefiting kind of at the detriment of everyone else. And when I say small group, I don't know the exact numbers, how many people rent versus how many people own. But let's keep this in mind. Only 1/5 of Californians live in rent-controlled cities. Now, only 1/5 of Californians live in rent-controlled cities. And not all of those people that live in rent-controlled cities obviously have apartments. A lot of those people have houses, right? So, 4/5 of Californians, right now, this isn't going to directly affect. It doesn't even directly affect any Californian because once this passes, if it passes, you would need someone else, like you'd need a city council or something, or the voters of a city, to pass an updated rent control measure that could do a number of things. It could basically add rent control on properties after 1995. It could add it to single-family houses, or it could prevent developers or apartment owners from actually setting their rates beyond what they've already set. Right, so who knows how the cities will exactly encounter this? I mean, this is going to be years of bureaucratic, political, negotiation, wrangling, electioneering nightmare, right? That being said, I'd also be remiss if I didn't point out that in my Prop 2 video, I argued that local control was a good thing. I still generally believe that. The difference between Prop 2 and this is Prop 2 dealt with the best way to deal with the homeless mental health population. Right, and my objection to Prop 2 writ large was that it effectively was telling 58 counties how best to handle their mental health issues, right, via money, via monetary means, right? And I think that's not necessarily accurate because we don't necessarily have a guarantee of what solution would resolve the mental health crisis. Well, we do know what rent control will do. Rent control will help people who live in apartments. So if you're a person who lives in an apartment who is in a rent-controlled city and you're listening to this, Prop 10 is probably going to help you. I don't know how, because I don't know how a city is going to kind of work with the leverage that Prop 10 will give them, right? But if you're listening to this and you're in an apartment, you live in an apartment, you're going to live in an apartment for the next 15 to 20 years, and you don't think you're going to own your own home, I don't blame you, and it would make sense for you to vote for Prop 10, right? Because it's going to decrease your rates. But it's going to decrease your rates at the expense of everybody else. Because it's going to potentially reduce apartment supply. It's going to reduce single-family home supplies that are up for rent, right, as I previously discussed. So, in a neutral analysis of Prop 10, is that Prop 10 benefits a very strong segment of this population. Much like when you talk about President Trump and tariffs, right? Tariffs benefit a very small sector of our population, but it benefits them very clearly, very pointedly, and very visibly. So those people see the benefits of increased jobs, decreased competition, and they're happy. But for the rest of the United States, right, tariffs don't benefit them. They hurt them because they increase prices. But they do so gradually as part of it's more or less defined, right? It's less clear because when you're talking about taxes and things that raise things, right, you're talking about a variety of consumer prices that are affected by a variety of inputs, right? It's much less visible. Even though I'd argue it's just as clear, it's less visible and it's something that can be absorbed by the consumer, especially in this good economy. So less people are anti-tariff for that reason. And you get more people supporting tariffs because they help certain specified communities. Rent control is the same way. Rent control helps a very specified community, people living in apartments. It even helps people living in apartments in cities that aren't protected by rent control, like people in new apartments, although those would tend to cost more, right? And so maybe those people aren't as hurting, right? It affects them too, right? Because potentially they could be slapped with and they could be aided by a rent control resolution or law or ordinance that gives them less rates, that prevents them from paying as much, right? So if you are in a big city that either has rent control or is very likely to get rent control, I don't think, for the record, Stockton, Modesto are going to be rent control jurisdictions anytime soon. I don't know if Sacramento is. It might become a rent control jurisdiction, especially if this thing passes. You're benefiting. But if you're somebody who wants to buy a new home, right, you're not going to benefit. Because developers are going to be less leery, right? They're going to be more leery of developing new things, developing new homes, buying new property, if their profit margins are being slashed because of an unexpected variable in rent control. And that's the key, ladies and gentlemen. Economics is the art of planning for the prepared cost, right? When you know a cost is coming, you can plan for it, you can budget it, it works, right? You can still maintain profitability. But when an unexpected cost hits you and punches you in the face, right, that's when businesses go bankrupt, right? That's when people start losing profits, okay? When you are telling developers that things they contractually agreed to, things they built with the understanding that they would not be hampered by rent control are now going to be hampered by rent control, you erode their trust in the system. And that trust is necessary. And that's what people don't get. The economy works if people trust in it. Right? I know I kind of sound like South Park right now. Right? There was an episode of South Park where everyone started talking about like the economy as if it was God. Right? I don't believe that. But our economic system works if people are willing to invest in it, which means they have to trust in it. And if you erode developers' trust in the system, they're going to be less likely to invest in it. And it's hard to say, or it's hard to quantify how this will happen because, again, it's hard to quantify how cities will take the leverage that Prop 10 gives them. Right? So I can't provide exact numbers because it's a two-step process, right? This is only step one. But the reason I oppose this is because I think rent control is bad, right, for all jurisdictions. I think it's bad for San Francisco. I think it's bad for Stockton. I think the economic science is very clear on this, right? Rent control does not help most people because and that's the other thing. It reduces apartment availability too, right? So if you're somebody who wants to get a new apartment, right, and all of a sudden you see less apartments being built because less developers are willing to build apartments, you're out of luck. You're going to have to spend more money on transportation costs. You're going to have to go to a different place, right? The backers of Prop 10 are worried that people are leaving the state en masse, but I submit to you that they will if Prop 10 is passed. If Prop 10 is passed, they will leave the state because they will have nowhere to live. Because nobody will be building anything, right? That's the worst case scenario. Now, to be fair, it may not be that bad. It may be less. Like, you'll have some developers that will develop at less of a pace. But considering that the solution to California is more development, not less, you don't really want developers developing at any less pace, right? It may be a marginal effect, but it's going to be a marginally negative effect. And that's the problem. For everybody that isn't currently in an apartment, you're going to have a tough luck finding one in rent-controlled jurisdictions, right? So at the end of the day, Proposition 10, it does not solve the homelessness crisis. It doesn't even come close to solving the homelessness crisis. That is a ludicrous claim, right? It's also a ludicrous claim that it puts bureaucrats in control of rents. I don't buy that either. I think ordinances will be passed, and I think those ordinances will either be clear or be interpreted by lawyers and judges, right? But the problem is, it doesn't actually resolve the problems that it's pretending to resolve. It resolves a small problem, relatively speaking. I'm not saying that when I say a small problem, growing rents, they're growing at like 5% a year. That's huge. That's a problem, okay? But it's a small problem in the whole panoply. I just did the Pulp Fiction thing right there. In the whole panoply of homelessness, right? It's a small factor in that. It's a small factor because those people who live in apartments are less likely and less desirous, I would submit, of getting a house, right? I think if you're talking about new homeowners, you need to do something that doesn't interfere in their ability to actually get the supply for a home. Prop 10 potentially risks that by cutting into the margins of the same developers that are going to be needed to build homes. So, my opinion is that 10 is a no. To me, 10 is a no. I think it's a bad idea. My understanding of the polling is that most Californians agree that 10 is a bad idea. But it is crucial, I think, that we understand that, yes, some people are absolutely going to be helped by Prop 10, right? So I get why people in those situations would want to vote for it. I don't doubt that. But I think it comes at a definite disadvantage to new apartment buyers or renters, new apartment renters, new home buyers, current home buyers, current apartment owners, and pretty much all developers, right? And when you take that coalition of people together, and you realize those people are necessary to solve the homelessness crisis, it's probably a bad idea to interfere in any of their processes, right? Other than what we're already doing regulation-wise. So with that, I'm probably going to do one more video later tonight, but thank you guys for watching, and have a nice day.